How many times do we walk through a grocery store, taking items off the shelf, putting them into our cart or basket, never truly appreciating what it took for that item to be made or the story behind it? Take a can of Campbell's soup, for instance. In 1869, fruit grower Joseph Campbell and commercial canner Abram Anderson joined forces to form Anderson and Campbell Food Company. 16 years later, in 1895, they introduced the first ready-to-serve jar of soup, and 2 years after that, condensed soup in a can was first introduced to the world. For the next 100 years, Campbell's would pretty much dominate the soup market, but in the late 1990s, Campbell's was getting lost in the competition. It was an old company founded on old ideas and production processes, known in the industry as the beleaguered old brand, and it was losing market share at an alarming rate. What Campbell's needed was some new vision and some new leadership. That new leadership came in the form of a new CEO hire, Doug Conant, in 2001. Rather than cracking the whip and demanding more production efficiency from his employees, Doug chose to listen to the workforce and find out why they were so disengaged. Instead of creating more top-down strategies and policies, Doug made it his goal to get to know his employees, as many of them as he could. Instead of valuing share prices, spreadsheets, and production figures, Doug created the Campbell's Promise, which was summed up in Campbell's valuing its people. It wasn't without its difficult decisions and tough times. The first 3 years, Doug replaced 300 of the company's 350 leaders, cleaning house and promoting people who were further down the corporate ladder but showed tremendous commitment and some really great ideas. When Doug retired 10 years after taking over Campbell's, the company's share prices were strong. They had a remarkably committed workforce. Employee engagement had never been higher. Production levels were the best they'd ever been, and Campbell's was back on top. After Doug left Campbell's, the Harvard Business Review, Forbes, and a host of other business insiders began to dig into Doug's leadership to find the secrets of his success. That's when it was discovered that during the 10 years that CEO Doug Conant ran Campbell's, he had written more than 30,000 thank you notes during a season when the company only had 20,000 employees in all. 30,000 handwritten thank you notes. Do you have any idea what it would have taken to write 30,000 thank you notes? Not only a lot of paper and an intense commitment to gratitude, but awareness. He would have to listen to people's stories, catch their names, and recognize their accomplishments. Aside from awareness, he would have needed empathy. He would need to know what was going on in their life, what was encouraging them, what challenges they were facing, and how he could speak into their world. Aside from awareness and empathy, he would have needed to understand how inspiration and encouragement actually works. He would have needed huge amounts of self-awareness, knowing that as CEO, he could easily say the wrong thing or come across coercive. Just to even want to write that many notes, he would have needed compassion and humility, and to have held every one of his employees with a very high value. In short, Doug Conant had to have a very high emotional intelligence. This weekend, we're teaching out our fourth weekend in a series we're calling 101 Ways to Blow Up Your Life. Now, so far this month, our chapter-a-day reading adventure has taken us through the book of 2 Kings, and this past week we were reading the short 10-chapter-long book of Esther. Esther's a fascinating little book. It's a wonderful story full of intrigue, tension, and fantastic resolve. However, it's also a book of the Bible that never actually mentions God anywhere. If you're not familiar with the story, well, fasten your seatbelt as I whip you through the quickest telling of the story you have ever heard. King Xerxes is throwing a massive party, and he wants to show off his beautiful queen, but she's going to have none of it. So he banishes the queen from the palace. Understandably, he becomes sad, and nobody really wants a sad king, so his advisors hatch a plan, which is to launch a show called The Bachelor, with the king as the bachelor, but instead of 40 beautiful contestants, he's going to have 400. At the rose ceremony, King Xerxes chooses Esther, but Esther has a secret. She's a Jew, and nobody knows it. Esther's cousin, Mordecai, who had once saved the king from an assassination attempt, refuses to bow down to the king's sidekick named Haman. Haman, the second in command of the kingdom, asked the king for a favor. Let me not only kill Mordecai, but let me kill his entire race, and then I'll give a hefty donation to the king's treasury. King Xerxes, only half listening, says, "Here's my royal ring, do whatever you want." Mordecai tells Queen Esther what has happened, and Esther hatches a plan. She invites both the king and the prime minister Haman to her palace for a banquet. It's a great evening, and she decides to invite them back the next night to make her request to the king. In the meantime, that night, the king can't sleep, so he asks the royal bedtime story reader to come and read him the history of the kingdom, which is sure to put him to sleep. However, the royal bedtime story reader reads the part of the story of the kingdom where Mordecai saves the king. The king asks, "Hey, did we ever do anything to reward that fellow?" The answer was no. And the next day, the king asks his second in command what the king should do for somebody he really wants to thank and celebrate. Thinking it was himself, Haman makes this great suggestion about putting the royal robe on the man on the king's horse, and having a top noble parade the man around yelling, "This is the man the king wishes to honor." The king says, "Fantastic idea. Go get the royal robe and the horse and put Mordecai on it, and you run around yelling that stuff you just said." Haman is furious. However, he has a banquet to attend with the king and queen that night. That's when Esther asks the king, "Hey, what would you do if you found out that someone was trying to kill me and all my people?" Haman breaks into a cold sweat. Long story short, Haman doesn't make it through the night. The Jewish people are saved. Mordecai is promoted to take the place as prime minister. The end. Or is it? For a few minutes, we want to rewind the story and look for any hints of ways that people might have blown up their lives. And I want to suggest that there are a number. Now, let's review what we've identified so far as really great and highly effective ways to blow up your life. Number 1, pride. Number 2, expose your life to poisonous or toxic people. Number 3, obey God, but not fully. Number 4, do everything yourself and fail to delegate. Number 5, live with small expectations and faith. And last weekend, Carolyn taught us out the 6th way: worship the created rather than the creator, also known as idolatry. But here's number 7, lack emotional intelligence. Unlike CEO Doug Conant, both King Xerxes and Prime Minister Haman scored very low for emotional intelligence. Right around the same time as King Xerxes and Queen Esther, the Greek playwright Aeschylus penned the phrase, "Know thyself." Later, Socrates, Plato, and dozens of others picked up the same phrase, including Benjamin Franklin, who in 1750 wrote, "There are 3 things extremely hard: steel, a diamond, and to know oneself." Know thyself may have been one of the earliest forms of calling people to emotional intelligence. But the actual concept and phrase emotional intelligence wasn't talked about until the late 1960s, and not even then did it become popular, not until a book on emotional intelligence was released in the late 1990s. However, looking back, it's easy to see that emotional intelligence is what was missing in both King Xerxes' life and the life of Haman, the prime minister. Let me show you some of the evidence I found in my most recent reading of the book of Esther. In chapter 1, verse 8, we read, "By edict of the king, no limits were placed on the drinking, for the king had instructed all his palace officials to serve each man as much as he wanted." On the surface, this might just look like the king enjoys partying, but there's way more going on here than we first read. Verse 10 continues, "On the 7th day of the feast, when King Xerxes was in high spirits because of all the wine, he told the 7 eunuchs who attended him to bring Queen Vashti to him with the royal crown on her head. He wanted the nobles and all the other men to gaze on her beauty, for she was a very beautiful woman." Cracks are forming in the king's character and emotional facade until we read of the king's emotional implosion in verse 12. But when they conveyed the king's order to Queen Vashti, she refused to come. This made the king furious, and he burned with anger. The king was tethered to self-destructive patterns and drinking and anger. The king was incapable of naming and managing his strong emotions. The king was oblivious to how his request to the queen was manipulative, self-serving, degrading, and deeply damaging. The king, who had the most power in the kingdom, was powerless when it came to controlling his own destructive emotions. The king was unaware of how much fear was dictating his decisions. And as we read in the rest of the chapter, the king was incapable of resolving conflict in a mature and healthy way, as evidenced by his edict to banish the queen from the kingdom. Then we read this insightful little observation in chapter 2, verse 1. But after Xerxes' anger had subsided, he began to think about Vashti and what she had done and the decree he had made. So his personal attendant suggested, "Let us search the empire to find beautiful young virgins for the king." The little gap between verse 1 and 2 suggests that the king was finally feeling some remorse. He was beginning to feel his loss and had some regrets. But because he had created such an unhealthy environment, his attendants felt that it was their job to keep the king happy at all costs. So instead of helping him process his pain, they distracted and enticed him to produce the bachelor with 400 of the most beautiful women in the land. Adding to our list of ways that the king lacked emotional intelligence is that the king didn't process and deal with loss well. The king masked his pain with more dopamine, injecting activities and distractions, dopamine being the pleasure hormone. The king did not allow himself to grieve well. And not only was the king's own emotional life toxic, he created a toxic culture in the upper levels of leadership, as we see the same toxins leaking out of his prime minister, Haman. Verse 5, when Haman saw that Mordecai would not bow down or show him respect, he was filled with rage. He had learned of Mordecai's nationality, so he decided it was not enough to lay hands on Mordecai alone. Instead, he looked for a way to destroy all the Jews throughout the entire empire of Xerxes. Anytime you see someone so full of rage and destructive behavior, along with an utter disregard for other people's emotions, dignity, and personhood, you can't help but ask, what painful experience did this person have in their past, and what fear are they living with today? That they would be so oblivious and incapable of admitting and processing their emotions. Haman violated the principle that says, know thyself. Haman seemed unaware of his unhealthy need for affirmation and validation. Haman saw every problem as a nail, which meant he attacked every problem with a hammer. Haman was incapable of adapting to situations where he wasn't the center of attention or in control. Haman lacked organizational awareness and how his personal pain was impacting the policies of the kingdom. Haman hid his motives and the details of his program from upper management. In the end, if you walk through the ruins of Haman's life and legacy that were blown to smithereens, we discover that it was Haman's lack of emotional intelligence, strongly modeled and mentored by the king who lacked emotional intelligence, that blew up his life in a spectacular way. In a few minutes, we're going to dive a little deeper into growing a strong and healthy emotional intelligence. But for a few minutes, we just want to pause with a song. Now, it's a new song for us, and it's a song that takes us back to a moment some 3,300 years ago when God's people were captive slaves in Egypt. It's a song that celebrates God's ability to step into what keeps us captive, break the chains, and march us out into freedom. Today, if you're feeling constrained or bound, or a slave to anything, a past hurt, a powerful substance, a bad habit, the words or actions of someone who lacked emotional intelligence, or the consequences of your own lack, it's our hope that this song will remind you that God is always ready to take your hand and walk you to freedom. A few years ago, Elon Musk, who owns the Tesla brand and plant that builds electric vehicles in California, had a problem: on-the-job accidents. The plant was recording 30% more injuries on the plant floor than any of the other car manufacturers. So when this sort of bad press comes out, and you have $180 billion of resources at your disposal, what do? Well, you might start by hiring a PR firm to help manage your public embarrassment. Then you might fire a bunch of people to give the appearance of taking matters seriously and cleaning house. Then you might hire a bunch of safety officers to ensure that workers are following proper procedures, and hopefully, after all of that, there are less people getting injured. But that's not what Elon Musk did. Instead, he wrote an email to his employees, and this is what he wrote: "No words can express how much I care about your safety and well-being. It breaks my heart when someone is injured building cars and trying their best to make Tesla successful. Going forward, I've asked that every injury be reported directly to me without exception. I'm meeting with the safety team every week and would like to meet every injured person as soon as they are well so that I can understand from them exactly what we need to do to make it better. I will then go down to the production line and perform the same task that they perform. This is what all managers at Tesla should do as a matter of course. At Tesla, we lead from the front line, not from some safe and comfortable ivory tower. Managers must always put their team's safety above their own. King Xerxes and Prime Minister Haman back in the book of Esther could have taken a few lessons on emotional intelligence from Elon Musk. Truly effective leaders don't simply try to manage their bad press and dodge scrutiny. Truly effective leaders don't simply crack the whip and tweak the system. Truly effective leaders increase their involvement when there is a problem. Truly effective leaders come alongside of those under their care to listen, understand, and attempt to gain a new perspective, even if it might reflect badly on themselves. Truly effective leaders, truly effective people, have high EQs, emotional quotients, or what we know as emotional intelligence. So here's something you should be asking right about now, because I want you to always be asking this question. Is this biblical? Emotional intelligence can sound a bit like a pop psychology idea, but is it actually rooted in God's Word? The short answer is absolutely, but I can appreciate that you might want a little bit of a longer answer. So for starters, let's acknowledge the elephant in the room. Many Christians walk around with this sense that faith is good, but feelings are bad. After all, how many of us were taught that we need to put faith at the front of the engine of our train, and feelings should be in the very last place as the caboose dragged along at the back of the train of our lives? That's why so many people deny them and suppress them and ignore emotions and even block them. But here's a biblical fact. God created emotions, and God is a God that experiences emotions. We know from Scripture that God grieves, God sings and dances, God gets happy, God has joy, God gets angry, God weeps, God laughs, and God loves deeply. Psalm 90 verse 11 says, "Lord, who fully knows the power of your passion and the intensity of your emotions?" We were created in the image of God, which means we too have intellect, desire, will, and emotions. I actually love how we get our English word emotion and what it means. These days, we're all pretty familiar with e-books, e-cigarettes, e-commerce, e-waste, e-bikes, e-mails, of course, e-sports, and 1,000 other e-items. Well, let me introduce you to emotion. Emotion comes from a Latin word that means to move. Emotions are what motivates us to move. God designed our emotions as a way to get us moving. Emotions are the inner response that motivate our outward actions. Let's look at 1 Peter 5, 7-8 to understand this better. It says, "Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. Be self-controlled and alert. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour." Anxiety and worry and fear are the emotion. They're there to alert us to stress and threat or danger. And as a result of that stress or threat or danger, you're going to move. A motion will be sparked into action. The recommended motion or action is to be self-controlled, alert, and to cast that anxiety on God because God cares. However, someone lacking emotional intelligence, emotional awareness, and the ability to manage their emotions may try to medicate that anxiety or hide that anxiety, blame others for the anxiety, or deny the anxiety. And that's when the roaring lion will get you. Here's a powerful description of how this works. What we believe about God and life provides the direction we choose to pursue and directs our experiential, emotional response to our world. Let me say that again. What we believe about God and life provides the direction we choose to pursue and directs our experiential, emotional response to our world. When you believe God doesn't see you, doesn't love you, doesn't care for you, or have the power to intervene, that belief, plus your anxiety, will move you towards an unhealthy response to anxiety, fear, and worry. However, when you believe that God cares for you, when you believe that God is interested and able to carry your anxiety, when you believe that the roaring lion of evil will try to entice you away from God, you'll share your anxiety, pray, give your anxiety to God, and trust Him to help you with it. Church, our emotions always nudge and move us to action. And they nudge and move us in one of two directions: a healthy movement in motion or an unhealthy movement in motion. People who have grown their emotional intelligence understand how emotions work. They understand that those emotions grow out of the situation that we're in, plus what we believe. King Xerxes was in a tough situation. He had many high society guests that he was entertaining, and the party had lasted for days. He had foolishly called for his wife to parade around for his guests. She refused. He then believed he would look weak to his guests. Lie. He believed all women in the kingdom would begin resisting their husbands. That's what the text says. Another lie. He believed his ego was more important than his wife's honor. Another lie. He believed he was in an unsolvable situation. Another lie. So his anger erupted, and his emotion moved him to banish her from the kingdom. Likewise, Prime Minister Haman insisted that everybody bow down to him. Mordecai refused. Haman believed that he deserved to be bowed down to. Lie. He believed his significance and reputation was built on his ability to get everybody to bow down to him. Lie. He believed anyone who didn't bow down to him was disrespecting him. That was another lie. He believed he needed to maintain control over people or he'd look weak. Lie. So his anger erupted, and his emotion moved him to issue an order that Mordecai and all his people would be killed, which backfired and blew up his life. Let me give you one of the strongest verses in the Bible encouraging us to be emotionally intelligent. King David writes in Psalm 42:5, "Why am I so overwrought? Why am I so disturbed? Why can't I just hope in God?" Can you feel how healthy that is? The psalmist is self-aware. He's looking inside of his own heart and analyzing his own emotions. He's doing open heart surgery on himself, saying, I feel overwhelmed. I feel agitated and disturbed. I feel hopeless and like God is far away. Now, knowing that my emotions are there to move me, what direction will I be moved? His options are to become angry or depressed, or try to drink his emotions away, blame others for his circumstances, blame the government, blame COVID, blame the latest restrictions and health orders, blame his boss, lash out at his spouse, blame God. But look at what he does with his bad situation and some kind of messed up emotions. He adjusts his beliefs. This is what it says. Despite all my emotions, I will believe and praise the one who saves me and is my life. Proverbs 12:18 says, there is one who speaks rashly like the thrust of a sword, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. In other words, like King Xerxes and Prime Minister Haman, there are people who lack emotional intelligence, thinking that their emotions are true and allow those emotions to create motion, and what comes out are words that thrust and cut like a sword. But those who are wise, those who have emotional intelligence, they take a bad situation, add biblical truth, and their words bring healing. So how do you know if you have emotional intelligence? Number one, you can recognize, name, and harness your own emotions. We call this self-awareness. King Xerxes and Haman were incapable of this. Number two, you can see and identify emotions in others. This is called empathy. King Xerxes and Haman were oblivious to this. And number three, you are aware of how your own past impacts your present, aware of your own brokenness. King Xerxes and Haman ran from this. So, how does a person become more emotionally intelligent? Well, let me give you 4 simple phrases that you can begin to use today, this week, that could be a great start to become more emotionally intelligent. Here's the first one. Phrase number 1. I'm feeling blank, but I wonder why. Remember what King David said in Psalm 42:5. Why am I so overwrought? Why am I so disturbed? Why can't I just put my trust in God? An amazingly powerful phrase that grows your emotional intelligence is, I'm feeling blank, but I wonder why that is. Students, guys, husbands, women, wives, whoever you are, I challenge you to say this phrase out loud to someone you trust this week. I'm feeling frustrated. I'm feeling sad. I'm feeling really trapped. I'm feeling angry. I'm feeling scared. I'm feeling insignificant. I'm feeling lost. I'm feeling insecure. I'm feeling worried. But I wonder why. Because that's a massive step to becoming more emotionally intelligent. Phrase number 2. I sense you're feeling blank. But is that accurate? The only way that you will get better at identifying emotions in others is to practice and experiment a bit. But what a great way to stretch your emotional intelligence muscle. I can't think of a better way than to say, I sense you're feeling this, but is that accurate? Try it out this week. And phrase number 3 that I challenge you to say out loud this week. I think my past causes me to blank. For me, this phrase would sound like this. I think my past causes me to fear conflict. I think my past causes me to fear people being mad at me. I think my past causes me to try to earn people's approval and love. And I think my past causes me to earn approval through ridiculously hard work. But what is it for you? I challenge you to say to someone that you trust this week, I think my past causes me to blank. And here's our final phrase, number 4. I think I've believed a lie and need to replace it with this truth. Allowing God to replace your lies with His truth is a powerful way to become more emotionally intelligent. Now, if you forget these phrases, they're going to be on an Instagram and Facebook message application question post, so you can actually have them with you all week long and you can practice them. I'm feeling blank, but I wonder why. I sense you're feeling blank, but is that even accurate? I think my past causes me to blank. And number 4, I think I've believed a lie and need to replace it with this truth. Church, our emotions can be the greatest and healthiest motivation, but they can also lead us to very dark, relationship-killing, shame-filled, and broken places. But that doesn't have to be our story. We personally know the one who created emotion. We personally know the one who has promised to carry the weight of our brokenness and shame, rescue us from our failures, and give us resurrected life. And His name is Jesus.